The table was set. The lights in her apartment window still glowed, but the chair meant for 21-year-old Elena Ramirez stayed empty. Hours earlier, she had walked out of the campus library with a friend, someone she trusted, someone who promised to bring her home. By dawn, her car was found in the parking lot, the keys inside, her books neatly stacked on the passenger seat. But Elena had vanished. Detectives chased every rumor, every whisper of a stalker in the night, but the truth was not out there in the shadows. It was sitting across from her in the library, smiling like a friend. 2 decades later, a single trace of blood would finally speak, and what it revealed shattered everything her family thought they knew. If you want to know how a trusted friend could hide a deadly secret for 20 years, make sure to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. Elena Ramirez was 21 years old, a psychology student at Arizona State University in Phoenix, with a reputation for being both determined and warm-hearted. Her friends knew her as the kind of person who was always willing to listen, the one who volunteered to help classmates catch up on notes, or who stayed late at the library long after everyone else had gone home. On the night of May 3, 2000, Elena was doing exactly that. Finals were approaching, and the university library was buzzing with stressed-out students. Elena, however, was not alone. With her was David Mercer, a fellow student she considered a friend, someone she trusted enough to study with until the early hours of the morning. Security cameras recorded them entering the library around 8 o'clock that evening. For nearly 4 hours, they sat across from one another at a long wooden table stacked with textbooks, notes, and half-empty coffee cups. Other students would later recall that Elena appeared tired but cheerful. David, on the other hand, seemed restless, often staring off into the distance or scrolling through his phone. Nothing about the night seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that it would end in tragedy. Shortly after midnight, Elena and David gathered their books and packed up their bags. Security footage shows them leaving through the side exit, Elena pushing her long, dark hair over one shoulder, David holding the door for her as they stepped into the warm desert night. The footage captured only a few seconds, but those few seconds would later become crucial to investigators. They are the last clear images of Elena alive. According to David's initial statement to police, he offered Elena a ride back to her apartment complex, a place only a few miles away. He told them he drove straight there, dropped her off, and then headed home. It sounded simple, almost routine. For many years, it was the story he repeated whenever detectives questioned him, but the details never quite fit. When police canvassed the area around Elena's apartment, they found her car sitting quietly in the lot. The red Toyota Corolla was locked, the keys resting on the driver's seat. Inside were Elena's textbooks and notes stacked neatly on the passenger side, as though she had prepared for another long night of studying. Her purse was still there, untouched. The scene felt staged, too orderly for a young woman who had just stepped out of a car at midnight. Neighbors at the apartment complex were questioned. One woman recalled hearing the distant sound of a car door closing around the time Elena should have been arriving, but she never saw anyone walk toward the building. Another tenant, coming home late from work, reported something stranger. He said he noticed a man leaning against a car near the lot, watching quietly, though he could not be certain who it was. None of the residents reported seeing Elena that night. Friends from campus would later tell police that Elena had been uneasy in the weeks before her disappearance. She confided to one roommate that David had recently told her he wanted more than friendship. Elena, always gentle in her honesty, told him she valued him as a friend but did not feel the same way. From that point on, she noticed a change in his behavior. He became jealous when she spent time with others, and once confronted her about walking to class with another male student. She brushed it off as awkwardness, but it left her unsettled. On that last night, Elena had no reason to believe danger was waiting in the passenger seat of David's car. She likely believed she was accepting a simple ride home from someone she trusted. someone she had studied with many times before. What she could not know was that this ride would end differently. When investigators pieced together the timeline, the inconsistencies in David's account stood out. There was no security footage of Elena entering her apartment. No witnesses saw her step out of the car. The only certainty was that she left the library alive and that she never made it through her front door. This was the last night of Elena Ramirez's life, and it was the night that marked the beginning of a mystery that would haunt her family, her community, and detectives for the next 2 decades. At dawn on May 4th, 2000, the morning sun rose over Phoenix and revealed a scene that would puzzle detectives for decades. Elena Ramirez's red Toyota Corolla sat quietly in the parking lot of her apartment complex. From a distance, it looked ordinary, just another student's car parked after a long night of studying. But when investigators looked closer, the details painted a far more troubling picture. The vehicle was locked. Inside, Elena's purse rested on the passenger seat, neatly positioned as though she had set it down just moments before stepping out. Her books were stacked in an orderly pile, notes tucked into the creases of the pages. There were even grocery bags in the back seat with unopened items, small signs of a young woman balancing the responsibilities of school and life. Nothing was scattered, nothing broken, nothing to suggest a struggle inside the car. To anyone walking past, it might have seemed unremarkable, but to detectives, it raised immediate questions. If Elena had returned home as her friend David Mercer claimed, why were her purse and keys left behind? Why had she not taken her belongings into her apartment? And, most chilling of all, why was there no sign that she ever stepped out of the car and into the safety of her building? Officers began by canvassing the area around the complex. They knocked on doors, asking tenants if anyone had seen Elena arrive. One neighbor, who lived directly above the lot, recalled hearing a car door close sometime after midnight, but when she looked out of her window, she saw nothing unusual. Another tenant, returning from a late shift, reported a man standing near the vehicles, lingering longer than seemed natural. His description was vague, tall, dark hair, wearing a jacket despite the warmth of the night, but investigators filed it away. The Corolla itself was processed as a potential crime scene. Technicians dusted for fingerprints, swabbed for DNA, and examined the locks and handles. The doors showed no signs of forced entry. The ignition was intact. On the driver's seat, they discovered a faint smudge, a possible bloodstain so light it could barely be seen under normal light. This was carefully documented and collected, though the technology at the time offered little hope of identification. For Elena's family, the discovery of the car was both a relief and a nightmare. A relief because it meant she had made it close to home, that her disappearance had not occurred miles away. But a nightmare because the car was empty, silent, and offered no explanation for where she had gone. Standing in the lot, her parents clutched one another as officers walked them through the scene. To them, it felt like Elena had been plucked out of existence in the span of a heartbeat. Detectives tried to reconstruct the timeline. Elena was last seen leaving the library just after midnight with David. If he had dropped her off, as he claimed, she should have walked directly from the car into her apartment. Yet no one saw her enter. There were no surveillance cameras in the lot, no electronic door logs to confirm her movements. The car seemed to be the only trace she had left behind. Rumors quickly spread across campus and the community. Some believed Elena had staged her disappearance, pointing to the untouched groceries as a sign of haste, perhaps a plan to run away. Others whispered of abduction, suggesting someone intercepted her between the car and her apartment. Detectives, however, were troubled by the detail that no personal items were missing. Elena's wallet, identification, and phone were all accounted for. If she had left voluntarily, why would she leave everything behind? In the days that followed, the Corolla became a haunting symbol of the case. Reporters filmed footage of it being towed away for further analysis, the red paint catching the light of the desert Sunday. Viewers across Phoenix watched the coverage with unease, sensing that this was no ordinary missing person case. The car was not just abandoned. It was a silent witness, holding secrets that investigators had yet to unlock. Years later, when cold case detectives reopened the files, the car remained a focal point. The samples, taken from that faint stain, preserved carefully in evidence storage, would eventually yield the truth. But in May of 2000, all it offered was silence, a locked shell of what should have been a safe return home. For investigators, the abandoned Corolla marked the first undeniable sign that Elena Ramirez's disappearance was not a choice, not an accident, but the beginning of a crime that would remain unsolved for nearly 20 years. When a person vanishes, the first 48 hours are often described as the most critical. Investigators know that evidence fades quickly, witnesses forget, and trails go cold almost overnight. In the case of 21-year-old Elena Ramirez, those first 2 days would set the tone for an investigation that dragged on for decades. Within hours of finding Elena's car in her apartment parking lot, detectives from the Phoenix Police Department began the painstaking work of retracing her steps. They started with the last known sighting, Elena leaving the university library just after midnight, accompanied by her friend David Mercer. Security cameras confirmed the two walking out together, their bags slung over their shoulders, heading toward the lot where David's car was parked. That footage marked the beginning of a timeline investigators would spend years dissecting. Police spoke first with David. He presented himself as cooperative, sitting down for an interview the same morning. Elena's family reported her missing. His story was simple. He and Elena had studied together until midnight. He drove her to her apartment. She got out of his car, thanked him for the ride, and walked toward her building. Then he left. He claimed he went straight home and had nothing more to do with the night. On the surface, David's statement seemed reasonable. He was a familiar face in Elena's life, not a stranger lurking outside the library. There were no outward signs of animosity between them, but detectives quickly noted how carefully rehearsed his account sounded, as though he had gone over the story in his head several times before speaking it aloud. Meanwhile, officers canvassed the apartment complex where Elena lived. They knocked on doors and questioned anyone who might have been awake around the time she was supposedly dropped off. A neighbor who worked a late shift told police he remembered hearing a car pull into the lot sometime after midnight. He thought he heard a door slam, but when he looked out of his window, he saw nothing unusual. Another tenant said she had seen a tall man loitering near the cars earlier in the evening, but could not identify him. None of the residents reported seeing Elena walk from the car to her building. Detectives turned next to Elena's classmates and friends. They painted a picture of a dedicated student who had no reason to disappear on her own. She had a close relationship with her family, a clear academic path, and even plans for the summer. Several friends, however, mentioned something else. They said David had become increasingly possessive of Elena in recent weeks. He did not like when she studied with other people, and he had confessed to her that he wanted more than friendship. Elena had gently rejected him, making it clear she valued him only as a friend. This revelation shifted the tone of the investigation. While there was no direct evidence against David, detectives began to wonder if his account of that night was as innocent as it seemed. If he had feelings for Elena and she had rejected him, had something happened in the car after they left the library? Forensic teams examined Elena's vehicle more closely. They confirmed what had already been noted. No signs of forced entry, no struggle inside the car. Her belongings were untouched, but one small piece of evidence stood out. On the driver's seat, beneath the faint smudge previously collected, was a tiny speck that appeared to be blood. It was too little to test with the methods available in 2000, but it was carefully preserved in evidence bags. At the time, it offered no answers, only more questions. By the end of the first 48 hours, police had little to show. Elena was missing. Her car was found locked with her belongings inside. There were no witnesses placing her inside the apartment complex, no footage of her return, and no usable physical evidence pointing directly to a suspect. What remained was David's statement, the suspicions raised by her friends, and a growing sense that something was being hidden. Detectives could not prove it, but the unease lingered. The first 2 days of the investigation had passed, and with them the best chance of finding Elena alive. For her family, the waiting was unbearable. They gathered in her apartment, staring at the untouched textbooks and half-finished notes she had left behind, hoping for a knock at the door that never came. They did not know it yet, but those first 2 days, the hours when answers should have been found, would slip away. The case would fall into silence for nearly 20 years. When news of Elena Ramirez's disappearance spread across Arizona State University, fear gripped the campus like a tightening fist. Students who had crammed late at the library alongside her could not believe she was gone. Professors who knew her as a bright and diligent psychology student found it unthinkable that she would simply vanish. Elena was the kind of person who lit up a room, the friend who remembered birthdays, the classmate who quietly explained a concept again when others were too embarrassed to ask questions. To many, she was a symbol of what was good and hopeful about youth. Now she was missing, and the silence left in her absence felt unbearable. Within 24 hours of her disappearance, students organized candlelight vigils. Dozens gathered on the steps of the library, where Elena had last been seen, holding photos of her smiling face and whispering prayers into the desert night. The vigil grew each evening, candles multiplying until the steps flickered with light. Reporters from local stations filmed the crowds, their voices solemn as they reminded viewers that Elena had vanished without a trace. The story quickly moved from local news to statewide headlines. Flyers were plastered across campus and the surrounding neighborhoods. They showed Elena's photograph, her long, dark hair cascading past her shoulders, her warm, brown eyes frozen in a smile. The bold words, "Missing Student," screamed from the top of every sheet. Students stuffed the flyers into backpacks, pinned them on notice boards, and taped them to lamp posts. Her face became unavoidable, a haunting reminder that something terrible had happened to one of their own. As the days passed with no sign of Elena, fear turned into speculation. Whispers spread in dorm hallways and cafeterias. Some students claimed they had seen a suspicious car circling campus late at night. Others swore there was a man watching women as they walked to their cars. Soon the rumor hardened into a single terrifying idea. A stalker must be hunting students. The university administration, under pressure from both parents and the media, scrambled to respond. Campus security increased patrols around dormitories and parking lots. Escorts were offered to students walking to their cars after dark. Professors began canceling evening classes, not wanting students to linger on campus late into the night. What had once been a place of study and safety now felt charged with paranoia. For Elena's friends, the rumors cut deep. Many of them knew about her strained friendship with David Mercer, though few suspected he might be involved. Instead, they looked outward, imagining a faceless predator. It was easier to believe a stranger had taken Elena than to imagine betrayal by someone she trusted. Local newspapers ran headlines that stoked the fear. "Is a predator stalking campus?" One read. The words sprawled across the front page. Parents called their children late at night, urging them not to walk alone. Sales of pepper spray spiked at local shops. Some students even withdrew from classes, unwilling to stay on a campus that suddenly felt dangerous. At the heart of the panic was Elena's family. Her parents stood before cameras, their voices shaking as they begged anyone with information to come forward. They attended every vigil, clutching one another's hands tightly, their faces lit by candlelight. For them, each flyer and each headline was a reminder of their daughter's absence, a wound that refused to close. Yet, even amid the fear and rumors, there was an undercurrent of hope. Many students believed Elena might still be alive, that she had been taken but could be found if they acted quickly enough. Volunteers organized search parties, combing nearby desert trails and riverbeds. They returned empty-handed, but the effort united the community. The disappearance of Elena Ramirez was no longer just a missing person case. It had become a collective trauma for the university, a dark cloud hanging over every classroom, every study session, every walk across campus at night. In the span of a few days, the university had transformed from a place of learning into a place of fear, and Elena's face stared back from every wall as the symbol of that unease. As investigators dug deeper into the days and weeks leading up to Elena Ramirez's disappearance, one name kept resurfacing: David Mercer. On paper, David was just another college student, a young man in his early 20s with an unassuming presence. He was not a stranger lurking in dark alleys. He was someone Elena had studied with, laughed with, and trusted enough to spend late nights in the library alongside. At first glance, his role in her life seemed harmless, but friends began to tell detectives a different story. According to several classmates, David had grown increasingly possessive of Elena. What began as a casual friendship had taken on a tone that made others uncomfortable. He was always around, often waiting for her outside of classes, offering rides home even when she had made other arrangements. Some friends described it as clingy. Others used the word obsessive. When detectives asked about their dynamic, Elena's roommate provided a telling detail. Only weeks before her disappearance, Elena had confided that David had admitted he had feelings for her. She told him she cared for him as a friend, but nothing more. She wanted to keep things platonic. According to the roommate, Elena was gentle in her rejection, careful not to hurt him. But from that point on, she said, David's behavior shifted. He became jealous when Elena spent time with other classmates, especially male friends. He questioned her about where she was going, who she was with, and even why she had not returned his calls quickly enough. It was subtle at first, but the pattern grew more obvious. One friend recalled a study group session where David became visibly irritated because Elena had chosen to sit next to another student instead of him. Another remembered him interrupting a conversation she was having, almost as if to remind her he was still there. To Elena's circle, it was uncomfortable but not alarming enough to involve the police at the time. She brushed it off, telling her friends that David was simply struggling with boundaries. She believed he would eventually move on and accept the friendship for what it was. What she did not know, and what detectives would later suspect, was that David's rejection had festered into resentment. As rumors spread across campus, students whispered about David's fixation. Some thought it was harmless infatuation, the kind of unrequited love that burns hot and then fades away. Others were less certain. They recalled the way his eyes followed her across a room, the way he seemed to isolate her from others. Detectives pressed David about these claims during their interviews. He dismissed them, saying people were exaggerating. He admitted he had once told Elena he liked her, but insisted she had been clear about her feelings and that he had accepted her decision. To police, he portrayed himself as the good friend who had been unfairly cast in a suspicious light. Yet the rumors would not go away. The more investigators spoke to Elena's friends, the clearer the pattern became. David inserted himself into nearly every aspect of her life. He knew her schedule, her classes, her routines. He was often the last person to see her at night and one of the first to reach out in the morning. What had started as a friendship now looked like dependence, and possibly something darker. For detectives, these accounts painted David not as a background character in the story of Elena's disappearance, but as someone who demanded closer scrutiny. If Elena had rejected him, and if he had struggled to accept that rejection, then perhaps the night of May 3rd had been a breaking point. The campus community, already tense from Elena's disappearance, latched on to these whispers. The theory of a faceless stalker began to give way to a far more unsettling idea, that the danger had not come from outside the circle, but from within it. The notion that Elena's trusted friend might have played a role was almost unthinkable, yet the fragments of testimony all seemed to point in his direction. By the end of that week, David Mercer was no longer just a friend who happened to be with Elena on her last night. In the eyes of many, he had become the prime suspect. 2 days after Elena Ramirez disappeared, investigators returned to her apartment complex. They had already searched the parking lot and her car, but something about the scene still felt incomplete. Detective Maria Lopez, one of the leads on the case, gave a direct order. Every dumpster behind the property had to be searched, bag by bag, no matter how unpleasant the task. The work was tedious. Officers in gloves and masks dragged heavy trash bags onto the pavement and began cutting them open. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of spoiled food, rotting paper, and discarded bottles. At first, nothing stood out. The piles contained the ordinary leftovers of student life: empty pizza boxes, crumpled soda cans, torn flyers, and broken pencils. Then, one officer found something that changed everything. At the bottom of a torn black bag lay a notebook page. The lines of text were faintly smeared, but the handwriting was neat, deliberate, and instantly familiar to those who knew Elena. More disturbing was the dark stain that spread across the top corner of the page. Under the harsh sunlight, it appeared to be blood. The officer froze and called over his supervisor. The page was carefully lifted with tweezers, placed into an evidence bag, and logged. A hush settled over the search team as word spread of the discovery. It was the first piece of physical evidence directly tied to Elena since she had vanished. At the crime lab, analysts worked quickly. The handwriting was compared to notebooks taken from Elena's room. The style matched perfectly. The same looped letters, the same slightly slanted lines. The words themselves seemed to be part of an assignment, ordinary notes about psychology. Yet the blood stain made them extraordinary. Tests confirmed that the stain was indeed human blood. In the year 2000, there was not enough material to build a full DNA profile, but it was preserved in the hope that future methods would succeed. Detectives debated what the notebook page meant. Had Elena been attacked near her apartment, her notes discarded as her attacker tried to clean up? Or had someone planted the page to mislead the investigation? Both possibilities were chilling, but the existence of blood suggested violence that could no longer be ignored. Officers canvassed the complex once again. One tenant said she remembered hearing the sound of something heavy being thrown into the bins in the early morning hours. Another reported seeing a figure near the dumpsters, a man with dark hair carrying a backpack, though she could not recall his face. The leads were thin and inconclusive, yet investigators carefully documented them. The discovery devastated Elena's family. When told that her handwriting and blood had been found, her mother wept openly, clutching the rosary she carried each day since her daughter vanished. For the family, the fragile hope that Elena might have run away or been hiding was replaced with the terrifying certainty that she had been harmed. News of the discovery spread quickly through the media. Local stations ran headlines about bloody evidence linked to the missing student. Students on campus whispered about the page, some calling it a sign that a predator was leaving trophies behind. Fear deepened, and the idea of a stalker roaming the university gained strength. Despite the breakthrough, detectives hit another wall. The notebook page confirmed foul play, but it did not identify who had harmed Elena or where she was. There was no body, no weapon, and no suspect tied directly to the evidence. The blood-stained page was boxed and placed into storage, sealed with the hope that science might one day speak where human witnesses could not. For almost 20 years it would remain silent, waiting in the darkness of an evidence locker, a reminder of how close investigators had come and how far they still were from the truth. By the end of the summer of 2000, the case of Elena Ramirez had grown quiet. Detectives had chased every possible lead, but none of them had brought answers. The discovery of the blood-stained notebook page had confirmed foul play, yet it stopped short of naming a suspect. The stain was too small for the technology of the time to generate a full profile. Forensic science had preserved the clue, but it had not unlocked its secrets. The spotlight that had once burned brightly on the investigation began to fade. News coverage shifted to other stories. The nightly vigils on campus grew smaller, and the whispers of fear on the university grounds slowly dulled. For the public, life moved forward. For Elena's family, time stood still. Detectives who had once pounded on doors and stood before cameras now had little to report. The lead investigator submitted periodic updates, but each one sounded the same. No new evidence, no witnesses, no progress. Files stacked up in the cold case unit, gathering dust in boxes labeled with Elena's name. David Mercer, the last person known to see Elena alive, remained a person of interest, but the lack of evidence shielded him from charges. He graduated from college, took a job in information technology, and slipped into the rhythm of adult life. He dated, married, and eventually started a family. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared ordinary, a quiet man who kept to himself. Few knew that his name had once been tied to a missing persons case that haunted Arizona. For Elena's parents, the silence was unbearable. They kept her bedroom exactly as it had been on the night she disappeared. The bed was neatly made, her textbooks lined up on the desk, her favorite sweater draped across a chair. Each May, her mother placed fresh flowers on the windowsill, whispering prayers into the stillness of the room. Her father carried her photo in his wallet, showing it to anyone who would listen, asking if they remembered her. The family pushed for answers wherever they could. They wrote letters to the police department, urging them not to let the case slip into obscurity. They met with journalists, pleading for media coverage. They even consulted private investigators, though none could uncover evidence stronger than what the police already had. Friends of Elena tried to hold on to her memory, but as years passed, the intensity of the search dwindled. Graduations came and went, jobs pulled them to new cities, and their own lives grew busy. Yet, every May, a small group gathered on campus to light candles and speak her name, determined not to let her story fade completely. For the detectives assigned to the cold case files, frustration lingered. They knew the truth was out there, hidden in the silence, but they did not have the tools to reach it. Advances in forensic technology were beginning to show promise in other cases, but the resources were limited, and not every piece of evidence could be tested. Elena's blood-stained page waited, preserved in storage, marked as potentially significant. It was evidence that belonged to the future. The years rolled on. 5 years passed, then 10, then 15. The world changed, but for the Ramirez family, the pain did not. Every holiday meal felt incomplete. every birthday haunted by the absence of their daughter. Her younger cousins grew up without her. Her parents grew older with grief etched into their faces. David Mercer built a life that looked respectable from the outside. Yet he carried the knowledge of what had happened that night. The lack of charges allowed him to move freely, while Elena's family remained imprisoned by uncertainty. The silence of the case became its own kind of noise, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what had never been found. The name of Elena Ramirez faded from headlines, but not from the hearts of those who loved her. And somewhere, in an evidence locker, a single page of notes stained with blood sat in the dark, waiting for the day when science would finally give it a voice. For the Ramirez family, life after May of 2000 was divided into two parts: the years before Elena disappeared and the years after. Nothing was ever the same. What had once been a lively home filled with laughter, the sound of music drifting from Elena's room, and the smell of her mother's cooking became a place weighed down by silence and grief. Her parents could not bring themselves to change her bedroom. It remained frozen in time, a memorial disguised as a living space. The walls were still decorated with posters of her favorite bands. Her psychology textbooks still lined the desk, and her bed was neatly made as though she might return at any moment. On her dresser, a framed photo of Elena smiling with her younger cousins stared back at her parents each time they entered. For them, the untouched room was both a comfort and a wound. It preserved her presence but also served as a daily reminder that she had never come home. Each May, on the anniversary of her disappearance, her family held a vigil. At first, dozens of neighbors, classmates, and community members joined them. They gathered in the park near the Ramirez home, candles flickering in the desert breeze, prayers whispered into the night sky. Her mother would stand in front of the crowd, clutching Elena's photo, her voice breaking as she begged the public not to forget her daughter. Her father, less outspoken but equally devastated, lit the first candle each year, holding it high until his hand trembled from the strain. As the years went on, the crowds at the vigils grew smaller. Interest in the case faded. New tragedies took over the headlines, and many people who had once supported the family moved on with their lives. But the Ramirezes never missed a single year. Even when only a handful of people showed up, they lit their candles, prayed, and stood in silence for the daughter who had been stolen from them. The grief did not stop at vigils. It seeped into every corner of their lives. Holidays became unbearable. At Christmas, her mother set an extra place at the table, unable to face the reality that Elena's chair would remain empty. On her birthday, her father drove to the desert outskirts of Phoenix, standing alone with flowers in his hands, speaking to her as if she could hear him. For them, the rituals were not just expressions of pain, but attempts to keep her alive in memory. Family gatherings became strained. Cousins who had once played games with Elena grew up and moved forward, but every milestone was shadowed by her absence. Weddings, graduations, even simple family dinners carried an unspoken weight. The Ramirez family existed in two worlds. The present they endured, and the past they longed to return to. In interviews, her mother often described the torment of not knowing. She said it was worse than death because there was no closure, no grave to visit, no certainty about what had happened. Every ringing phone brought a surge of hope that it might be Elena. Every news story about an unidentified body brought fresh fear. The waiting became its own form of torture. They fought to keep Elena's case alive in the public eye. They contacted newspapers, appeared on local television, and distributed flyers long after most people had stopped paying attention. Her father kept a binder filled with articles, leads, and letters, convinced that one day the truth would come out. He refused to let his daughter's name fade into obscurity. For nearly 2 decades, their agony was sustained by a cruel mixture of hope and despair. hope that Elena might be found, despair that each year passed without answers. The vigils, the untouched bedroom, the photos scattered around their home were all pieces of a life that had been shattered but never abandoned. The world may have moved on, but for Elena's parents, time had frozen on the night of May 3rd. Their agony was not just the pain of losing a child, but the torment of never knowing how or why. That silence was a weight they carried every single day, a wound that refused to heal. For nearly 2 decades, the case of Elena Ramirez sat in the cold case files of the Phoenix Police Department. The evidence was preserved, the notes carefully logged. But without new technology, there was little detectives could do. Each year her parents called the department hoping for updates, and each year the answer was the same. There were no new leads. By 2019, however, forensic science had transformed. Across the country, old cases were being reopened and solved through the use of advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. Stories filled the news of decades-old murders being cracked, of suspects long hidden finally facing justice. The success of these methods gave hope to detectives who had worked Elena's case years before and had never stopped thinking about it. One of those detectives, now working in the cold case unit, reviewed Elena's file and focused on a piece of evidence that had always bothered him. The blood-stained notebook page recovered from the dumpster at her apartment complex. At the time of discovery in 2000, the stain was far too small to produce a full profile. Only a partial result had been possible, and it was inconclusive. But 2 decades later, the technology was different. Laboratories could now analyze even the smallest traces of DNA with astonishing precision. The decision was made to resubmit the evidence. The page, carefully sealed and untouched since its recovery, was sent to a specialized crime lab that handled cold cases. Forensic scientists worked meticulously, extracting every possible strand of DNA from the faint stain. Days turned into weeks, and anticipation grew. The Ramirez family was notified that the sample was being re-examined. For them, it was a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that after so many years there could finally be answers. Dread that the results might confirm the worst of their fears. When the results finally arrived, they changed everything. For the first time, investigators had a complete and viable DNA profile. The sample confirmed that the blood on the page did not belong to Elena. It belonged to someone else, someone male. That revelation alone was monumental. It proved that Elena had likely struggled with another person, and that his blood had mixed with her belongings. The profile was uploaded into national databases. Detectives waited anxiously to see if a direct match would appear. No immediate hit came back, but the profile was strong enough to be used in the rapidly advancing field of forensic genealogy. By comparing the DNA to public genetic databases, scientists could identify relatives of the unknown man and begin to build a family tree that might lead back to the suspect himself. The detectives who had lived with the weight of this case for so long felt a shift. For years they had stared at the same photographs, the same files, the same unanswered questions. Now, science had cracked open a door that had been sealed shut since 2000. The possibility of identifying Elena's killer was no longer a dream. It was suddenly within reach. For Elena's parents, the call from the department was overwhelming. After 19 years of silence, an officer told them that there was new information, that the blood on the page was not their daughter's, and that a DNA profile had been created. Her mother wept, both from sorrow and relief. Her father gripped the phone in silence, unable to speak, knowing that the fight for justice might finally be nearing its end. The breakthrough electrified the team. Detectives began planning surveillance strategies, potential interviews, and the next steps once a suspect was identified. The family tree, created from the DNA profile, pointed toward several possible relatives, narrowing down the search. For the first time in nearly 20 years, investigators had momentum. The stain that had once been dismissed as too small to be useful had become the turning point of the entire case. What had sat in an evidence locker gathering dust was now the most powerful clue in the search for the truth. The DNA breakthrough did more than provide a name. It reignited a case that many had nearly given up on. It proved that patience, persistence, and science could breathe life back into even the coldest of cases. And for the Ramirez family, it was the first real sign that the silence surrounding their daughter's disappearance might finally be broken. The year was 2019, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, investigators had a viable DNA profile connected to the disappearance of Elena Ramirez. The profile, pulled from the blood-stained notebook page, had not matched anyone in the National Criminal Database. But when the sample was run through genealogical systems, a web of distant relatives appeared. Slowly, analysts built out family trees, tracing back generations and then narrowing forward again. The branches converged on one familiar name, David Mercer. For detectives who had worked the case from the beginning, the name hit like a jolt of electricity. David had been the last person to see Elena alive. He had been the friend who claimed to drop her off at her apartment, and the young man her friends described as jealous and controlling. He had been questioned, scrutinized, and labeled a person of interest, but for years there had been nothing to tie him directly to a crime. Now, science was saying what witnesses could not. The DNA from the blood-stained page pointed straight at him. Still, suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed direct confirmation, something that could stand in court. Detective Maria Lopez and her team made the decision to put David under surveillance. He was now in his early 40s, living in Phoenix with a wife and 2 young children. He worked as an information technology specialist for a local firm, where colleagues described him as quiet and dependable. To the outside world, he looked like a family man with an ordinary life. To detectives, he looked like a man who had been hiding a terrible secret for almost 20 years. For several weeks, an unmarked surveillance team followed David's every move. They watched him drop his children off at school, commute to his office, and run errands around town. The goal was simple: to collect a fresh DNA sample without his knowledge. This required patience. Investigators could not confront him directly, and they could not risk tipping him off. Instead, they waited for him to discard something that could be legally collected and tested. The opportunity came on a warm evening in late September. David stopped at a gas station convenience store after work. Surveillance officers watched as he purchased a bottle of water and a cup of coffee. He drank the coffee in his car before tossing the cup into a trash bin outside the store. As soon as he drove away, investigators moved in. Wearing gloves, they retrieved the discarded cup, sealed it in an evidence bag, and rushed it to the state crime lab. The wait for results was excruciating. For nearly 2 decades, Elena's family had been tormented by silence. Now, detectives stood on the edge of an answer, knowing that the test could either confirm their suspicions or send them back to square one. When the results finally came in, they left no room for doubt. The DNA profile from the blood-stained notebook page and the DNA collected from David Mercer's coffee cup were an exact match. Statistically, the odds of the sample belonging to anyone else were so small that prosecutors described it as impossible. The blood on the page belonged to David, the same man who had claimed he left Elena safe at her door. For Detective Lopez, it was both a triumph and a moment of sorrow. Triumph because the case that had haunted her for nearly 20 years finally had a suspect. Sorrow because the confirmation meant that Elena's life had almost certainly been taken by someone she trusted. News of the development spread quickly within the department. After years of frustration, The case had reached a turning point. David Mercer was no longer just a person of interest. He was the prime suspect in the disappearance and likely murder of Elena Ramirez. Behind the walls of the Ramirez home, the family braced themselves as detectives shared the news. The confirmation was both relief and heartbreak. Relief that science had finally provided the link they had prayed for. Heartbreak that the link led back to a man they had once welcomed into their daughter's life. The shocking match left no question unanswered. David Mercer's DNA had been found on evidence tied directly to Elena's disappearance. The case that had stood still for almost 20 years was suddenly alive again, and this time investigators were ready to move forward. By early 2020, the investigation into Elena Ramirez's disappearance had shifted from suspicion to certainty. The DNA recovered from a discarded coffee cup had matched perfectly with the profile preserved from the blood-stained notebook page found in the dumpster 2 decades earlier. For detectives, the match was the green light they had been waiting for. After years of silence, they finally had the evidence to make an arrest. The decision to take David Mercer into custody was not made lightly. Investigators knew he had been living an outwardly ordinary life in Phoenix. He was 41 years old, married, with 2 children in elementary school. He had worked steadily as an information technology specialist, and to most of his colleagues he was seen as reliable, quiet, and professional. But detectives also knew the risks. They had to ensure that the arrest went smoothly and that David did not have a chance to flee, destroy evidence, or harm anyone else. In March of 2020, the Phoenix Police Department coordinated the operation. Surveillance officers tracked David's daily routine for weeks in preparation. They learned the exact time he left home in the morning, the route he drove to his office, and even the parking space he usually took in the company lot. They wanted to minimize any possibility of resistance. On the morning of the arrest, unmarked vehicles surrounded the office building. Plainclothes detectives waited inside the lobby, blending in with office workers. Others positioned themselves at the exits, ready to intercept if David tried to escape. At precisely 9 o'clock, David arrived, carrying his usual travel mug of coffee and a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He nodded to a colleague in the hallway, unaware that several sets of eyes were fixed on him. As he stepped into the elevator, 2 detectives joined him. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor, where his office was located, uniformed officers were waiting. One detective calmly identified herself and informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Elena Ramirez. David froze, stunned, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The scene inside the office was surreal. Co-workers who had known David for years stood in shock as their quiet, dependable colleague was led away by police. Some whispered in disbelief, convinced there had been a mistake. Others admitted later that they had always sensed something reserved, even secretive, about him, though they had never imagined anything like this. David was escorted through the lobby and out the front doors, where marked patrol cars were waiting. Photographers from local news outlets, tipped off by police, captured the moment. The images of David in handcuffs, wearing his work shirt and slacks, were broadcast across Arizona within hours. The headlines were explosive. Cold case breakthrough. Arrest made in 2-decade-old disappearance of student. For Detective Maria Lopez and her team, the arrest was a moment of vindication. They had carried Elena's case for nearly 20 years, haunted by the lack of answers. Now they had a suspect in custody, and not just any suspect, but the man they had suspected since the very beginning. At the police station, David was processed and booked. During questioning, he initially denied any involvement, insisting the DNA evidence must have been contaminated. Detectives remained calm, presenting him with the overwhelming scientific proof. His denials weakened, and though he refused to confess outright at that stage, The silence in the interrogation room spoke volumes. For the Ramirez family, the call from police brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief that someone was finally being held accountable, anguish that it had taken so long, and devastation that the man responsible had been sitting among them all those years, blending into the background of their lives while they searched for answers. The arrest of David Mercer did not close the case, but it marked the beginning of the end. The man who had once presented himself as a loyal friend, who had built a facade of respectability as a family man and professional, was now revealed as the person who carried the weight of a deadly secret for 20 years. The mask had finally been stripped away. When David Mercer was led into the courtroom in the summer of 2021, nearly every seat was filled. Reporters, community members, former classmates, and most importantly, the Ramirez family all sat in tense silence as the man accused of killing Elena Ramirez faced justice. 2 decades of unanswered questions had built to this moment. Prosecutors wasted no time in laying out their case. They began with the story that had haunted investigators for years. On the night of May 3, 2000, Elena and David studied together at the university library. She had always regarded him as a friend, someone she could trust. But in the weeks leading up to that night, she had grown uneasy. Friends testified that David had confessed romantic feelings for her. Elena had been kind but firm. She valued him only as a friend. She wanted nothing more. According to prosecutors, that rejection festered in David. On the night of her disappearance, as he drove her home, the tension finally broke. Inside the car, words turned into an argument. When Elena repeated that she could not return his feelings, David snapped. In court, the prosecution painted a vivid picture of what happened next. David struck Elena, likely knocking her unconscious. Panic set in. He did not take her to her apartment as he claimed to police. Instead, he drove her body out of the city, down deserted roads that wound into the dark edges of the desert. There, prosecutors said, he hid her remains in a shallow grave near the Salt River Basin. For years, David denied everything. He told investigators he had dropped Elena off safely, and he lived under that lie, building a career and raising a family while Elena's parents lit candles for a daughter who never came home. But DNA, preserved for 2 decades, had caught up to him. The blood-stained notebook page was irrefutable proof of his connection to Elena's final hours. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the DNA might have been transferred innocently. But the jury listened to weeks of testimony from forensic experts. They heard how the blood could not have been contamination. They heard from classmates who described David's possessive behavior, his jealousy, and his inability to let go of Elena. Piece by piece, the image of an obsessed friend turned predator came into focus. Then came the turning point. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a life sentence without parole, David agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he admitted what investigators had long suspected. That night, Elena rejected his advances once again. Enraged, he attacked her. When he realized what he had done, he panicked and hid her body in the desert. The confession was both devastating and relieving for Elena's family. Devastating, because it confirmed their worst fears. Relieving, because after 21 years of silence, they finally knew the truth. As part of the plea agreement, David led authorities to the location of Elena's remains. Detectives and forensic teams combed the Salt River Basin, digging carefully until they uncovered skeletal remains. Items found with the body, including jewelry and fragments of clothing, confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Elena had been there all along. In the courtroom, Elena's mother wept openly as prosecutors read the terms of the confession. Her father sat stone-faced, gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When given the chance to speak, her parents addressed David directly. They told him that while they could never forgive him, they were relieved that their daughter could finally be laid to rest. The plea deal meant that David avoided the death penalty, but he was sentenced to decades in prison. For the Ramirez family, it was not perfect justice, but it was accountability. After 21 years, the man who had taken Elena from them was no longer free to live a normal life. The trial and confession closed one chapter of the story but opened another. The family could now begin the painful process of mourning properly. They had answers, but answers did not erase grief. Elena's name, once whispered in fear and uncertainty, was now spoken in remembrance and truth. When investigators uncovered Elena Ramirez's remains near the Salt River Basin, the desert was silent. The sun beat down on the dry earth as forensic teams carefully brushed sand and gravel away from bones that had been hidden for more than 20 years. With them lay fragments of clothing, a single earring, and a bracelet her mother instantly recognized. Forensic testing confirmed what the family already knew in their hearts. At last, Elena had been found. For her parents, the discovery brought a mix of relief and devastation. Relief because they finally had the answer they had begged for since the year 2000. Devastation because the answer was final. Elena was never coming home. Her mother fell to her knees when she was told, whispering prayers into the hot desert air. Her father stood in silence, tears sliding down his cheeks, clutching the bracelet that had once belonged to his daughter. The funeral took place 2 months later. The church was filled beyond capacity. Friends, classmates, professors, neighbors, and strangers who had followed the case over the years crowded into the pews. Elena's photo, framed with white flowers, was placed near the altar. Her coffin, draped in a pale cloth, seemed impossibly small for the weight of grief it carried. Her family finally gave her the ceremony they had prayed for. Candles flickered, hymns filled the air, and her parents spoke through tears about the daughter they had loved and lost. They spoke of her laughter, her kindness, and her dreams of becoming a psychologist. They spoke of the 21 years she had lived and the 21 years they had spent searching for her. Mourners held one another and wept openly, the pain of the community pouring out after 2 decades of silence. Outside the church, hundreds gathered to release balloons into the sky, each carrying a note or prayer written for Elena. The balloons rose into the blue until they were specks of white, drifting out of sight. For the Ramirez family, it was a symbolic farewell, a way of letting go while still holding her memory close. The community reeled at the truth. For years, many had believed Elena had fallen victim to a faceless predator, someone lurking in the shadows. The revelation that her killer had been David Mercer, a friend she trusted, left residents stunned. Parents whispered warnings to their children about the dangers of misplaced trust. Students who had once walked the same campus halls as Elena reflected on how easily friendship can mask obsession. The case also changed how law enforcement approached cold files. The success of genetic genealogy in solving Elena's disappearance was seen as a landmark for Arizona investigators. Detectives from across the state began reviewing unsolved cases, hopeful that forgotten evidence might one day speak through DNA. Elena's story was used in training seminars, a reminder that persistence, science, and time could achieve what once seemed impossible. For Elena's family, life after the trial was quieter but still heavy with grief. Her mother continued to keep her bedroom intact, though now it was more shrine than waiting room. Her father often visited her grave, speaking softly as if she could hear him. The vigils held each May transformed from pleas for answers into ceremonies of remembrance. Though justice had come, it could never erase the pain. The betrayal cut deeper because it came not from a stranger, but from a trusted friend who had hidden behind a mask of loyalty. The Ramirez family carried that wound with them, but they also carried Elena's memory. They made it their mission to ensure her story was never forgotten. In the end, Elena's disappearance was not just a story of loss, it was a story of resilience. A family who refused to stop searching, a community that rallied together, and investigators who would not let the trail go cold. The answers had come too late to save her, but they had come nonetheless. And in that truth, Elena finally found her way home. Elena Ramirez's story is a haunting reminder that danger does not always come from the shadows. Sometimes, it comes from the people we trust the most. For 20 years, her family lived in silence, clinging to hope, waiting for answers that seemed impossible. In the end, it was science that gave her a voice and exposed the truth that had been hidden for so long. The arrest and confession of David Mercer closed one of Arizona's most painful chapters, but justice came at a heavy cost. Elena's dreams, her laughter, and her future were stolen. What remains is the strength of a family who never stopped fighting, and a community forever changed by the betrayal of a trusted friend. If you want more true stories of betrayal, justice, and cold cases finally solved, make sure to subscribe and like this video. Your support keeps these stories alive.